let's speak about abolition, right? Because the idea is that the British had a sort of a epiphany of consciousness sometime in the late 1800s, and they decided to ban slavery. And they official history says that they did, and then they even sort of fought. They deployed their navy to fight slave ships. And it's interesting because at the same time they still own most of the colonial world. They're still shattering India through plagues and everything else. And then there's all sorts of new developments that happen in the Western world. There's American War for Independence, all of those things. But just kind of how much of that do we get wrong?
Basically, the whole thing. That is, well, I mean, so first of all, does it make sense on the face of it that the people that operated the largest, most brutal slave trade in human history would also be the authors of freedom? Does that does that pass the smell test, or does that cause us to question the moral investment that they have in reproducing that narrative? So the first historian to kind of systematically debunk this was a Caribbean historian of African descent, Eric Williams, in his classic Capitalism and Slavery. And he makes the argument essentially that the form of mercantile enslavement that had produced the wealth of Britain throughout the 18th century was now inhibiting the growth of an industrial economy in England. And so he sees this as a conflict inside of capitalism. I think that what my contemporary colleague at Harvard University, Vincent Brown, who's written on Tacky's Revolt, a Jamaican uprising, Caribbean uprising of the enslaved, would add to this is that what really drives the British towards abolition is the fact that the enslaved resist on massive scale and make slavery increasingly expensive over the course of the 18th century. There are large scale organized slave rebellions that make the military expenditure and the kind of systematic repression and violence that is needed in order to keep the system going. That provides a particular kind of pressure from one side. Now, there is a morally rooted critique of slavery that emerges in Britain specifically that leads to a kind of liberal, argument for abolition of the institution. But even that is not the thing that people think that it is. So that is usually associated with William Wilberforce, who is the person who makes the case most effectively and in an impassioned way to the British Parliament, leading alongside these economic pressures, the kind of two different economic pressures that I just sketched, the one from Eric Williams and the other from the violence of the armed resistance of the enslaved. Those things come together, leading to the 1807 abolition of the international trade by Britain. But that person, Wilberforce, is actually the student of the first great British abolitionist, a person called the Reverend Thomas Clarkson. And the Reverend Thomas Clarkson in 1789 writes a treatise called Letters on the Slave Trade, where he details the abolitionist movement led by African Muslims in the Senegal River Valley beginning in the 1770s. And he says that this is his inspiration for making an abolitionist argument. And he says of the leader of an African Muslim anti-slavery movement in the Senegal River Valley, a person called Abdul Qadir Khan, who is known in the sources from that time just as Al-Mami Abdul Qadir. Al-Mami is the Fulani rendering of El-Imam. He is not a king. He is an elected leader that can be deposed through representative democratic institutions. And this person, Abdul Qadir Khan, Al-Mami Abdul Qadir, is described in Clarkson's Letters on the Slave Trade. He said that this wise and virtuous man has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion than any of the sovereigns of Europe. He actually uses about 25% of the page count in his first treatise on the abolition of the slave trade, describing an African Muslim abolitionist movement that precedes him by a generation. And he's not um, uh, this is not a fictionalized account. Clarkson has actually sat down with slave ship captains that have been coming back from Senegal and interviewed them. He does an interview with a French botanist that speaks fluent Wolof and lived on the mainland for years. He constructs this detailed history of an abolitionist movement. And I write about that abolitionist movement in my first book, The Walking Quran. But I also make the point that going back to the time of Afonso in the 1520s, and for all of those hundreds of years between them, And even in the time after Abdul Qadir Khan, there are Africans that are striving to abolish the slave trade. The Africans are trying to opt out of the system time and time again. As long as the demand for enslaved Africans is this principal motor in the global economy, and as long as Europeans are willing to assassinate anyone who will not comply with this order. Here's what Clarkson says. Clarkson says, if you study European intervention in Africa in the era of the slave trade, he says you will find that their method is to, through schemes of bribery and intoxication, transform African kings from shepherds to wolves amongst their people. That there's this systematic effort to cultivate trading partners that will give the Europeans what they want. And of course, time and time again, when African abolitionist movements rise, they are brutally put down by European force and often by political assassinations. The leaders of these African abolitionist movements almost all die as martyrs.